Dear guests, welcome to our 7th seminar of our series, Historians and the War, Rethinking the Future. First, a small technical announcement. The seminar today will last about 2 hours, and in the second part, we have a Q&A section. If you want your questions to be discussed, please write them down into the chat. As always, the seminar will be recorded and later be published on the YouTube channel of the German-Ukrainian Historians Commission. I will post a link to the channel and all the partner institutions into the chat during the seminar. The languages of today's discussion will be English and Ukrainian. There is the option of simultaneous translation. If you want to hear that translation, you have to click on the icon with the globe at the right bottom of the screen. And yeah, that's all. Thank you for your patience. And now I would like to give the word to Natalia.
Thank you, Georgi. I would like to extend my sincere welcome to all in attendance today. Thank you so much for joining us from wherever you are. Good evening or good morning. Also, thanks to all the participants who have agreed to join this important conversation. We have been facing the ongoing crisis in the world for more than half a year. This can be considered the largest war, especially in Europe, of course, since 1945, but also we are witnessing the unraveling of history as we go forward while observing the events happening on the territory of Ukraine. As of February 24, the Russian armed forces renewed its attack on Ukraine, launched its mass invasion, and fatalities and other casualties, of course, have been mounting since then. Russian military aggression on Ukraine is an assault on its sovereignty, democracy, people and their very right to exist as the Ukrainian nation. It is also a threat to a global democratic order, peace, security, international relations, economic stability. President Putin unleashed this war not only to erase Ukraine, but also, as we know, to erase Ukrainian history, identity, language, thus coming back to history, making history overall a very key part in this growing geopolitical crisis. Historians nowadays face an urgent need to address this crisis from the vantage point of historical studies. It is our responsibility to address such undoing of history by Russia and President Putin. The current war requires us to rethink basic views about modern European history, especially its 20th century, empires, nation states, regimes, ideologies, remembrance cultures, remembrance of World War II, of other mass crimes that have taken place and are, unfortunately, and continue to take place right now on the territory of Ukraine. Importantly for us, looking forward, how should we understand our history from the vantage point of today? What will become of this history tomorrow? This is indeed in response to these very questions that 5 international partners formed this important joint initiative as soon as we have started facing this global crisis. In fact, this is our 7th seminar, Historians in the War, Rethinking the Future. I'd like to mention our partners, German-Ukrainian Historians Commission, represented here by the co-chairs, Professor Dr. Martin Schulze-Wessel from Munich and Professor Dr. Yaroslav Hrynevych of Lviv, the Department of Eastern European History at Munich University, represented here by Dr. Martin Schulze-Wessel again, the Ukrainian Catholic University, Dr. Yaroslav Hrynevych, Ukraine-based scholarly journal Ukraina Moderna, Editor-in-Chief Dr. Gelinada represents it, and myself representing the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies here based in Edmonton, but also in Toronto and Lviv. This is our 7th seminar, as I've mentioned, and it is titled Stalin's Genocides, Soviet Warfare, and Atrocities of the Russian Army, from Soviet mass crimes to the current war in Ukraine, continuity or change. As Georgi mentioned, it's going to be held in English with simultaneous translation, and I'm very pleased to welcome our key organizer in this event, Dr. Kai Struve, and out of Martin Luther University, Wittenberg, to moderate this event. Kai, please take over.
Yes, thank you, Natalia, thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February was not only a breach of fundamental rules of international law, as you mentioned, but also the Russian methods of conducting this war and Russian rule in the occupied territories are characterized often by extreme violence and total neglect of international law of armed conflict and human rights. And the most extreme case so far in this respect clearly is the nearly total destruction of the city of Mariupol and the killing of probably more than 20,000 of its civilian inhabitants. Killings of civilians, torture, and sexual violence in the occupied territories that came to the light after the liberation of Bucha near Kiev and other places and other localities in that region. Many consider, meanwhile, to be cases of genocide, at least before the background of statements from Russian officials and in the Russian media that called for the destruction not only of resistance to Russian rule in the occupied territories, but also to any brutal suppression of any expressions of Ukrainian identity. Reports about arrests, killings, and torture from the occupied territories multiply in recent months, and many fear that the currently occurring crimes that are not different from those that the Russian occupiers committed in the liberated regions north of Kiev. Yes, in addition, we have also clear indications of mistreatments and torture, and perhaps, as in the case of the Hrynevych some weeks ago, also mass murder of POWs. The aim of our seminar now is to discuss the historical context and also the background of the Russian warfare and the Russian regime of occupation. What are historical traditions, experiences, and practices that may help to explain what we have seen in this war in recent months? In the Ukrainian and also the international public, the current Russian regime and its aims are often compared with Germany under Hitler, and it is discussed if Putin's rule can be considered fascist, as we also did at one of our previous seminars. However, to me, it seems to be quite obvious that this Putin's regime and also the Russian war in Ukraine are strongly rooted in history and tradition of the other most criminal regime of European history in the 20th century, that is those of the Soviet Union. In which way and which traditions there are, that is the question we would like to address in our seminar today. And I'm glad that we have 4 excellent experts for different aspects of the subjects that these 4 experts agreed to participate in our discussion today. And yes, our first speaker will be Katarina Buzor. She's a senior lecturer in international law at the Kiev Mohila Academy and currently a fellow at the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies in Regensburg. And already since 2014, she has worked on different legal issues related to the war and crimes in the Donbas region, among them sexual violence. And since the start of the Russian invasion in February, she is working on the documentation of Russian crimes in this new war. Andrea Graziosi is professor of contemporary history at the University of Naples in Italy and a leading expert of Soviet and Ukrainian history, especially of the period of Stalin's rule, and here most importantly also on the Holodomor. Vladyslav Hrynevych is a senior research fellow at the Kuras Institute of Ethnic and Political Studies of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences in Kiev, and he has published, among many other publications, also important studies on the Ukrainian society and the Soviet army during the Second World War. And our 4th panelist, Jan Behrends, is a senior research fellow at the Leibniz Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam in Germany and a professor at Munich University in Frankfurt. He has not only been an outspoken critic of the naive and badly informed German politics towards Russia already for many years, but he has also done important research on the late Soviet period, the Afghan War, and also Russia since the 1990s. Yes, I'm happy that we will have these four excellent panelists, and we will begin now with statements of about 10 minutes by the panelists, and then we'll maybe perhaps some additional questions or have a short discussion and between the panelists, and then we will continue with the Q&A part of our seminar. Yes, and please write your questions into the chat in English or in Ukrainian. Our first speaker is Katarina Buzol, who will give us an overview and also a legal assessment of what is known about Russian crimes in the current war. Please, Katarina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear colleague, for inviting me and tolerating a lawyer at your discussion. But as I will try to argue through my presentation, it is exactly the interdisciplinary approach which is needed to at least the justice efforts that I personally work on in helping Ukraine's counter Russia's aggression within the domain of lawfare. My presentation will consist of three principal parts. In the first one, I will outline the patterns of crimes and victimization that have been documented in the Russia-Ukraine armed conflict since its beginning, since 2014. In the second part of the presentation, I will point out what has changed since the full-scale invasion of February this year. And finally, in the third part, I will argue how the interdisciplinary research and knowledge transfer is needed for the proper response to Russia's aggression in the legal domain, in particular in establishing the alleged policy element in the crime against humanity of persecution and in assessing the alleged genocidal intent, which is needed both for establishing the crime of genocide and for establishing the crime of incitement to genocide, which, as we know, is a separate crime. I will start with a statement that I make at any presentation related to Russia's aggression. Although it's very commendable that the degree of professional and scholarly attention to the issue has really risen since winter this year, it is important to stress that not only Russia's aggression started in 2014, but indeed the numerous war crimes have been perpetrated for 8 years already. These are not my mere statements. I refer to the preliminary findings of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, who has been conducting a preliminary examination of the Russia-Ukraine armed conflict since 2014, and in her preliminary conclusions, even since the early years of the armed conflict, she pointed it out at alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated in Crimea and Donbass, and those included murder, enforced disappearances, torture, sham trials, unlawful detentions, rape, other forms of sexual violence. It is important to notice that these crimes usually targeted both sexes, both women and men. It is also important to point out that usually the alleged or the actual pro-Ukrainian position was often a catalyst for such crimes. For instance, the alleged crime of political persecution in occupied Crimea was often attributed in the cases of the silencing of the members of the Crimean Solidarity group, of the Crimean Tatar journalists who maintained or trying to maintain the freedom of speech in the occupied peninsula. Ukraine has been acting on these violations domestically, documenting, opening investigations and prosecutions, and internationally. Ukraine, since 2014, has reached out to all available international courts and tribunals, asking them essentially to address the different aspects of Russia's violations in the course of the aggression that fell within those respectable courts' jurisdiction. But what's notable, and I want to point it out, that, for instance, the International Criminal Court has had an opportunity, a right to indeed investigate these crimes since 2014. However, it needed the escalation of this year to actually proceed with an investigation. So as a lawyer, at least, I have noticed, if not inaction, but the unfortunate protracted action on the crimes that have been visible for quite a while. As to the changes that we have witnessed in the legal domain, in the legal assessments of Russia's conduct since February this year, I will point out the following. First, of course, it is the scale of crime, the territorial scale of crimes, which now affect the whole country. And indeed, it affects Ukraine's own ability to respond to these crimes, because previously there have been just these set groups of investigators and prosecutors who were already professionally dealing with Crimea and Donbass. And since February this year, essentially the whole criminal justice sector of Ukraine had to be mobilized. Second, the discussion included more arguments about not just war crimes, which are grave violations of the laws and customs of warfare, but more of the crimes against humanity, which are a widespread or a systematic attack on a civilian population pursuant to a state or organizational policy. So since February this year, in terms of the legal perspective, Russia's intention to target the civilian population en masse through torture, enforced disappearances, or targeted shelling has been more noticeable. Those were not separate single crimes anymore, as they could be qualified, for instance, in Crimea, in Donbass in the previous year. And finally, unfortunately, since February this year, there is an increasing debate about Russia's genocidal intent towards Ukraine, which, according to the current international legal definition, is an intention to destroy in whole or in part one of the four groups defined by the Genocide Convention or the Rome Statute, and in the case of Ukraine, that applies to the national groups. This genocidal intent is derived through the alleged genocidal rhetoric of the Russian military. For instance, the first rape victim who came out publicly, having been victimized by Russian soldiers, said that before victimizing her, they said that they had killed her husband because he was a Nazi. There were other reports saying that the Ukrainian population was targeted because of its national identity or political affiliation or political preferences, which could indicate the genocidal intent. Similarly, such new crimes as the deportation of people, especially the deportation of children, could be indicative of a genocidal intent. And this is something new that the lawyers are dealing with since February this year. And I think what I'm describing might sound quite obvious to you as well-established historians, but this is exactly what I want to point out, that for lawyers, not just Ukrainian, but international lawyers, many of whom are foreigners who start now working on Ukraine as investigators at the International Criminal Court, or as investigators in Germany, for instance, that who conduct universal jurisdiction proceedings, they don't necessarily know these subtleties. They don't necessarily know the legacy of Russia's attitude to Ukraine, of Russia's imperial and colonial attitude to Ukraine. And it has been the part of my legal practice to voice it as much as possible, at least to the international legal community that works on addressing Russia's aggression against Ukraine, that more introspection into the history is needed, and Russia's criminalization and the manipulation with, for instance, the legacy of the Nuremberg trials is also very indicative how understanding the historical subtleties of the issues of the region, of the domestic context in Ukraine and the Russia-Ukraine relations is crucial for establishing very narrow legalese categories such as a genocidal intent or the policy element of the crime against humanity of persecution. I will stop here and will be glad to respond to the questions further. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this overview of the introduction in how these very many and horrible crimes that probably in many places are still ongoing can be assessed and categorized also from the view of international law. Now we will, with our next speaker, Professor Andrea Graziosi, will come to the question of historical legacy, and the one or the maybe the core period for this may be the Stalinist period or perhaps the 1930s. Yes, and my question to you is, how is, in your view, your assessment of this problem?
Yes, hello. Thank you for inviting me. I have an easy task, which is to speak of the tradition of Soviet genocides that by now we know a lot, and a difficult task that I will deal with very briefly because it's very complicated, and is the fact how this genocidal past of the Soviet Union, which is undisputable by now, has an influence on first of all, on post-1953 Soviet history, because Soviet history is two-faced. There is a very violent phase before the death of Stalin, and there is a different, stage with Khrushchev, the thaw, but even under Brezhnev and then Gorbachev, which is indeed different. So, but also the difference between this Soviet history and Russian history, because I would leave to Putin the idea that the Soviet Empire was the same thing of the Soviet Union, and Russia today is the heir to both the Soviet Empire, to the Russian Empire, to the Soviet Union. This continuity in history do not exist. One has to explain continuity. It's not an evident fact. As to the easy part, we now know two things, that Soviet Union is the classical, I would say, locus of genocide in the 1930s. I think one could prove that there are at least 3 or 4 clearly, how to say, marked genocides according to the law. I'm not, I generally do not believe that historians are lawyers, but still I could, and we should not be lawyers, but I think it's a very good case could be made that the Holodomor was a genocide, the Kazakh tragedy that derived from the order to seize the meat, the herds of the nomads was a genocide, also culturally, not even physically. Also, I would say the Volga German Republic is a special case in needs of attention. And if I may say so, even from a certain point of view, given the legal definition, even the extermination of the Russian Orthodox hierarchy, which explains a lot of today Russian Orthodox Church behavior, you know that the Russian priests, the popes, were exterminated maybe 85% of them in the 30s. And if you think of the definition of genocide also as extermination of religion and so on, it fits. So there is on one side this very clear genocidal cluster in the 30s, both in the early 30s with the famines, but even later with the mass extermination of specific categories of people. Then you have another tradition that I would strongly stress, and this is tradition of mass liquidation of people. I think that, for example, when we think of denazification, I really, in quotation marks, of course, as it is today, we have to think of 3 or 4 basically precedents in Soviet history that clearly points to a continuity. One is the first, I think, is the extermination of the white officers that remain in Crimea in 1920. I would say more than 12,000 of them were exterminated with modalities and also with a mechanism very similar to the Katyn massacres of 19, of before World War, the beginning of World War II in the German Soviet sides of it. And then, of course, this goes from decossacization in 1919, which was defined as the percent, shooting of Cossacks. Then it was stopped, but it started as a specific policy of exterminating a percentage of all the Cossacks in the Northern Caucasus. Then this specific massacre of about 12,000 junior white officers in Crimea. Then, of course, the two kulak categories, especially the first categories of kulak in 1930, figures are not clear because there was people were allowed to shoot, Communist Party members were allowed to shoot kulak, but I think several scores of thousands of people were killed in a few weeks, targeted according to specific definitions. So this is, I would say, group liquidations. And it goes up to Katyn, of course. And this group liquidation, of course, when I first read about denazification, I thought maybe they're thinking on that scale, even maybe not physical liquidation on that scale, but certainly identifying groups and targeting groups and eliminating groups in Ukraine today. So here I think is maybe the clearest continuity. What is difficult, and now I come to the second part very briefly, it's difficult to see to track, to understand the impact of this in today's behavior. Because of course, when you think of, for example, of the massacres of Crimean white officers, Putin is clearly influenced by white ideology. So it is something different. If you think of the extermination of Russian Orthodox hierarchies in the 30s, and you think of Kirill today, there are links, of course, but are not so clear. Because first you have a church that was victimized, and then you have a church who supports victimization. So it's very difficult to prove, and that is, the link is there, but it's intellectually sophisticated to handle. I think, I will be very brief because this is, of course, that can be the subject of many discussions. I think that those two lives of the Soviet system that I spoke of at the beginning have a deep impact of this, because the second life, the more, let's say, tranquil life, without this mass extermination, mass famines, genocides, did not acknowledge the first stage. It did acknowledge Stalin's crime, in 1956, but with great ambiguities and, of course, a lot of, half truth, not even half, 20% truth. So actually the Soviet Union and Soviet history was reinterpreted as normal history based on the post-53 normalization. I think Western scholars and especially historians unfortunately contributed to this normalization, which didn't mean that we had to deny the real normalization, but the problem that the whole Soviet history was normalized. And this prevented us from seeing the growth already in the Soviet period, but especially after in the 1980s and the 1990s. I think the 1990s are the crucial decade of the birth, the emergence of a new ideological mixture that was tied to part of the Stalinist violence. On the other hand, it was not. I remember you that Putin, for example, opened a monument to Stalin victims and proclaimed himself an admirer of Solzhenitsyn for many. So it's a very deep, complicated cluster. At the same time, Putin and also the Putinist leadership and most Soviet post-1991 political elite very soon exposed this theory of a continuity between the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and Russia. I remind you that in 1993 already Zhirinovsky got the most vote at the election at the end of 1993 on a platform in which Ukraine was described with words very similar to the ones that Putin is using today and that the Russian television speakers are using today. And that this continuity, unfortunately, also to this theory that there is a continuity between the Tsarist Russia, the Soviet Union, and post-1991 Russia has been also, unfortunately, in a way supported by many Western historians, which is very, very unfortunate. I will finish with a consideration, because, you know, this is why it's difficult to explain the impact. I believe there is an impact of this terrible past, I'm telling you, but it's not easy. If you remember, for many years at the beginning, in 1991, what Putin now calls a catastrophe, the greatest catastrophe, was the national holiday of Russia, the declaration of sovereignty. So a day that was the national holiday, because it meant the independence of Russia from the Soviet Union, became the national catastrophe. And they subscribed to this idea that we are in continuation with Stalin with 1945. And then, of course, even the crime of Stalin got justified, and also those ambiguity surrounding Soviet history became, in a way, the breeding grounds of this new ideological, horrible phenomenon that we are dealing with. So I have to say, clearly there is, to finish, to summarize, clearly there are two traditions that I would point out, the genocidal one of the 30s, but also this targeting liquidation of specific group of people, which not always the United Nations Convention would call genocides, because, for example, it excludes the social groups as the kulak, as you know. But clearly there is this liquidating specific groups of people. And then this post-53 and especially post-1991 reinterpretation of history based on this sort of not acknowledging the past and what had been, and presenting the past of the Soviet Union but as something more or less good. Even recently, I will finish with this, I was amazed to read on, I think it was the Times Literary Supplement, a review of a book of a well-known historian that said that after all, the Soviet Union was a modernizing country, everything was fine. More or less, it gave, you know, good things to people. And of course, there are very small elements of truth, because it's true that after the 56, for a few years, there were things, but overall, it's not true. And one forget that, for example, Russian men, Soviet men, Ukrainian men had an average life expectancy of 61 or even 59, I think, in the early 80s. And in Italy, we were at 82. So it is really a combination of lies, of hypocrisy, of not clearly seeing our their history in a way, to which we unfortunately contributed, that created this new, I say this without problem, even if I'm an historian, this new monstrous ideology that we have in Russia today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Graziosi, for this several important points that I think we will come back to also in the later discussion. But now we continue with Vladyslav Hrynevych, and he will, in his contribution, he will focus on the period of World War II. And this is, I believe, probably an especially difficult period to assess, because the Soviet Union fought here in a war against the second or first murderous regime of 20th century European history, the Nazi Germany, that also at the same time committed genocidal crimes on Soviet and Ukrainian territory, and then at the same time was prevented from committing more only by its defeat by the Soviet army. Please, Vladyslav.
Добрий вечір. Дякую, що запросили. І я б хотів би зупинити увагу на тому, що Друга світова війна і досвід цієї Другої світової війни надзвичайно пов'язаний з тим, що, власне кажучи, сталося і зараз, і злочинами тими, які вчиняла російська армія на території України. Власне, коли ми говоримо про Другу світову війну і ми говоримо про ті злочини, які вчинялися під час Другої світової війни, а злочини вчиняються, як правило, всіми арміями і в усіх війнах. Але от, власне кажучи, на Нюрнберзькому трибуналі, де було визначено 3 основні такі групи злочинів, за які Вермахт і нацистська Німеччина несли відповідальність. Це був злочин проти миру, проти людяності і військові, воєнні злочини. Власне кажучи, всі ці злочини вчинив і Радянський Союз, і його армія, яка безпосередньо була основною зброєю Сталіна. Це і напад на Польщу, на Фінляндію спочатку, а потім вчинені масові злочини в тій самій Польщі. І коли ми порівнюємо те, що сталося під час Другої світової війни, і ті різноманітні, різні типу злочинів, які вчинялися на різних, до речі, територіях і проти різних народів, є дуже багато схожого, і можна порівнювати і робити певні висновки відносно сучасної України і Росії, і злочини, вчинені над росіянами. Ну, скажімо, якщо ми беремо польську війну 39-го року, коли радянська армія вчиняла масові злочини, вбивства військовополонених, грабунки і вбивство мирного населення, гвалтування і грабування. І цікавий момент, який, якщо порівнювати, можна настрої, які були у російських солдатів із глибинків, які вони приходили в Бучу, в Ірпінь, бачили багаті дома, бачили, як люди, рівень життя високий, і яке викликало це ненависть, певно. От щось схоже було тоді у Польщі в 39-му, а потім вже в 44-му, 45-му в Німеччині, коли радянських солдатів з їхньою низькою культурою і низьким рівнем життя і в Радянському Союзі надзвичайно дратувала, от, власне кажучи, що ці капіталістичні країни і люди ці живуть на такому високому рівні. Я підрахував, коли я займався проблемою, пов'язаною з радянсько-польською війною, що серед 3,5 тисяч вбитих поляків під час цієї війни загиблих, приблизно 15% було вбито радянськими солдатами вже як полонених. Тобто було злочено один з таких злочинів, вбивства військовополонених. Це була така Катинь перед Катинью. А через декілька місяців вже радянський уряд знищив десятки тисяч польських офіцерів в таборах, які отримали назву Катинського злочину. Я хочу привернути увагу ще до такого мало, до певної відомого, скажімо, аспекту, як злочини Червоної армії в Західній Україні, коли радянські війшли на територію Галичини, Волині, і проти них діяли тут УПА, Українська повстанська армія. І от боротьба з УПА, в якій брали участь безпосередньо війська Червоної армії, причому масово, вони призвели до того, що коли регулярна армія веде бойові дії проти партизанів, це дуже бруталізує війну, і під час цього знищувалися цілі села, вони бомбардувалися, обстрілювали танків з гармат, розстрілювалося населення, бралися закладники, гвалтували і грабували. І фактично сталінська боротьба проти УПА і ОУН і УПА в цей період можна розглядати геноцидне винищення українського народу. І такий прецедент є. І в Європейському суді Литва подала позов проти там деяких колаборантів, радянських колаборантів, які литовських, які воювали на боці Сталіна. І, власне кажучи, Європейський суд визнав, що тут є елемент геноцидного винищення литовського народу. Литовці подали 20 тисяч загиблих. В Україні приблизно 200 тисяч було вбито, до 100 тисяч виселено в Сибір. Загальна цифра десь 500 000 людей, які постраждали під час цих дій у Західній Україні. Я хочу сказати, що коли ми говоримо про певні такі паралелі, і як ми можемо зараз виходити на вивчення, дослідження психології, певних таких аспектів історичних, які пов'язані з тією радянською і цією російською армією. Власне кажучи, ця російська армія – це прямий спадок цієї російської армії. Вони і воюють так, тобто в військовому плані використовують значною мірою, і про це зараз багато кажуть. Вони мають ідеологію схожу, ідеологію ненависті. І ця ідеологія ненависті, вона призвела від міфів Великої Вітчизняної війни, на яких виховувалося радянське населення, а потім особливо російське населення. І ці міфи Великої Вітчизняної війни були основною, скажімо так, стрижнем російської ідентичності, на якій зараз виховується цей російський народ. От, власне кажучи, від цих міфів Великої Вітчизняної війни до побєдобєсія, яке стало причиною і певною мірою приводом нападу на Україну, на фашистів. І, власне кажучи, в Росії нічого не кажуть, що 6 мільйонів українців воювали в Червоній армії, і в тому ж самому 45-му році 20% Червоної армії складали українці. Ні, розглядається Україна як фашистська країна, яку треба, значить, повернути і навести тут. Ну і можна ще сказати, що ми говоримо про такі певні паралелі, крім таких, власне, виховання, низький культурний рівень російського солдату, погане керування офіцерами, низька дисципліна. Бо один з найбільш таких вагомих моментів, скажімо, та ж сама німецька армія, вона не мала таких масових злочинів проти місцевого населення, я маю на увазі, як та ж червона, яка прийшла в Німеччину в 1944 році. Саме через те, що для того, щоб утримувати цю високому рівні дисципліни, німецькі офіцери і генерали слідкували за тим, щоб не було от таких, скажімо так, проявів і злочинів проти місцевого населення, для того, щоб тримати на високому рівні дисципліну своєї армії. Ну і закінчуючи, я хочу сказати, що безумовно для того, щоб зрозуміти, що відбувається всередині цієї армії російської, без історії цієї Другої світової війни, без тих, навіть перерахувати всі ці злочини буде великий час забере. Це не тільки вбивство військовополонених. Ну, скажімо, дуже схожа певною мірою один з таких злочинів – це знищення міст, знищення, скажімо, тактика випаленої землі Сталіном, коли відходили, знищували, підривали заводи, спалювали поля. І, скажімо, в Києві був підірваний Хрещатик і навколишні райони столиці, в яких загинули сотні людей, і спалена була Успенський собор 11-го сторіччя, пам'ятник історичний, і багато таких моментів пов'язаних, власне кажучи, з цим. Тобто, ну, знаючи всю цю, як то кажуть, основу історичну цієї російської армії, ну, певною мірою це випадковість, це не таке щось таке з краю, що виходить за нашої свідомості межі. Це зрозумілий наслідок, от, власне кажучи, історичний цієї путінської армії. Дякую.
Yes, yes, Vladyslav, thank you very much for this discussion of possible continuities between the Soviet army in World War II and or in the German-Soviet War. But you addressed also the earlier period of the occupation of parts of Poland and the Baltic countries. Yes, and now we will. There are certainly a lot of questions and points that will be possible to discuss. But we will now first continue with our fourth and last speaker, that is Jan Behrends, who will now address the question of the late Soviet and period and the recent Russian history and previous Russian wars and their relation with the current war in Ukraine. Please, Jan.
Yes, thank you very much, first of all, for having me. And in a way, I have the easier task than Professor Graziosi, because the continuities, I think, are easier to point out and also to justify and to make an argument that there's an actual story that we can follow. I will talk about three great caesuras that I see in this period. This is 1979, 1993, and then, of course, this year, 2022. So I started in 1979 with the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, because I think actually that's where the story starts that we see here. Of course, we can look back as historians also to the Second World War or the Russian Civil War, the violent campaigns of Stalin. But if we talk about concrete people that are still sometimes in charge in the Russian army, and concrete practices also of illegal violence and war crimes, then I think it makes most sense to start with the Afghanistan war. And to point out, which people in Germany sometimes tend to forget, maybe not so much in Ukraine, that since Christmas, the infamous Christmas of 1979, when the invasion of Afghanistan was started, the Soviet Union, or then post-Soviet Russia, has been there has been a continuity of war and conflict. It has been at war ever since in these small-scale wars, post-Soviet wars, but then since this year also again in a full-scale European war, the attack on Ukraine. In all these wars, I would argue, well, to make a very simple case, we would have to go into more details. We can do that in the discussion. There were atrocities and war crimes. That none of these conflicts were fought even partially in accordance with the Geneva Convention and similar, international law. There were strong breaches of international law. There were war crimes. There was genocide, I would also argue, or at least the intent of genocide. In almost all of these conflicts. And this is, I think, important to understand the late Soviet Union and then post-Soviet Russia. I think that all of these conflicts and this history of conflict that we see since 1979 has very much shaped the political culture and even in a larger degree the whole society of post-Soviet Russia. One could also go into pop culture and other things which I won't do here. This continuity of experiences of war and violence, I think, is very instrumental to understand. During Perestroika, there was a first attempt to break out of this continuity, which was very much tied to the persona of Andrei Sakharov, who actually in 1989 tried to make the war crimes in Afghanistan an issue in the so-called People's Deputy Congress in Moscow, the semi-democratic parliament that was elected under Gorbachev. But already then, in the summer of 1989, the already quite sick and frail Sakharov was shouted down by the Afghanistan veterans who were also elected to this Congress. And this marked the first event, I think, where the chance to have a reckoning with this sort of practices was missed. And ever since, this has not happened. To the contrary, I think these people who were already very visible during Perestroika in the Congress of People's Deputies, they were sort of like the original core of the imperial conservative element in post-Soviet Russian politics. You can point to them as the people who first articulated very openly, not just in closed circles, but very openly, this sort of ideology that has now become dominant under Putin. And we can go back, as I say, all the way to Perestroika with this. Well, as we all know, Mikhail Gorbachev passed last week. Just 2 words about him. Also something that's often forgotten in Germany is not only the things that he did, but the things that he did not do, which I think are also very instrumental to understand post-Soviet Russia. Mikhail Gorbachev during Perestroika did not reform the army and did not reform the special services, the KGB and other secret services in the Soviet Union, and at no point attempted to do this. And I think this is very important because here we have a institutional continuity from the Soviet Union to Russia that in some ways is greater than in other aspects. If you look at the economy or at culture, where there was much more diversification, even in Russia, there was never a real reform of these very important institutions of force, this Siloviki. Also, we can go back to Perestroika and see that some of the conflicts that were created or that originate in this period are to this day not resolved. I cannot go into any details here because of the time reasons, but of course, I think about Karabakh or I think about the Transnistria Republic. And we may also, of course, talk about the use of force in Tbilisi in Georgia or in the Baltic states in the last year of Gorbachev's rule that sort of can be interpreted as legitimizing the use of force for the solving of political problems yet again. But I would say that the big caesura, actually the second big caesura when it comes to violence is 1993-94, the storming of the White House, because at this point there was a different model to resolve these sort of conflicts. Theoretically, at least, one could have had a round table, which would have been a Polish import to solve this sort of political crisis between the presidency on the one hand and the Soviet on the other hand. But one went for the violent solution of this political power problem. And if we look at it closely, then we can see that in 1993 already the people who advocate this violence, who support the violent solution of this in this power struggle are very often on both sides officers who have served in the Afghanistan war. So there's something of the legacy of the Afghanistan war in such figures as Pavel Gravchov and Alexander Rutskoy, to mention only 2 names. I could mention more. And again, there's the continuity until today. One of the commanders of the army during the putsch, but also during 1993, is now serving actually on the front as one of the commanders in the current war against Ukraine. So you have personal continuities as well. And in the 1990s, you have the Russian army as a very strong factor in Russian politics. Of course, 1994 then, the war against Chechnya, again with mass violence, the chistki, the destruction of villages, taking of hostages, a random murder, and so on. This is all very well documented. If you're interested in it, just go to the website, for example, of the International Court of Human Rights. You will find lots of evidence of cases against Russia. Right, and you have these political figures with Afghanistan background that are very strong in the 1990s. I will only mention three names: Alexander Rutskoy, Pavel Graschew, Alexander Lebed. They're all Afghanistan veterans, and they all, import sort of like this style of politics or conflict resolution, if you will, through war into post-Soviet Russian politics. And one can see the continuities from the Soviet time. One could also talk about their imperial ideology. They all published very imperial texts during the 1990s. But in the end, as we know, they lose the power struggle, and the Primakov and Putin faction takes over post-Soviet politics. That is the KGB and not the army. And today, of course, the army is much less influential in Russia than it was in the 1990s. It has sort of like retreated from Russian politics. Putin starts his tenure famously with the Second Chechen War, and his legitimacy, I think, throughout his whole tenure as president was always very much tied to military success. He was the one who was going to be successful in Chechnya, in contrast to Boris Yeltsin, and it would be kut gekut. Anything would go in Chechnya to achieve this military success. There's a very ruthless use of violence. Again, I could go into details. And we can see the continuities to today. For example, if we would compare the bombing of Grozny, the almost complete destruction of the city of Grozny, with what happened then in Syria in 2015, 2016, or now Mariupol. This is, for example, a very similar type of air war that was also conducted against the civilian population. Well, I mean, I think in this circle with this audience, I don't need to go into the details about Putin's rule, but we can see this cycle of escalation, rhetorical escalation, but then also escalation in practices of violence, rhetorical with the 2007 infamous Munich speech, where Putin basically declares war on the West, but we fail to notice, or at least our politicians in Germany failed to notice this. And then it's 2008, Georgia, of course, 2014, Crimea and Donbass, 2015, Syria, and the road to down to the invasion of February this year. In the very paradox, German politics and reactions to this, with sanctions on the one hand and Nord Stream on the other hand. So we try to have it both ways. Have some sanctions on the one hand, and of course the complete failure of this. And I would actually argue also the failure to notice the sort of violence, genocidal violence, often mass violence, that was conducted by the Putin regime from the very onset, and that is sort of like part and parcel of the politics of the Putin regime. And this has, of course, long been ignored by the European Union and by successive German and Western governments. Yeah, this is probably as far as I can take this argument. I could go into more details. Just one final remark. Together with colleagues in Lviv, but also with Polish colleagues from the Rafal Lemkin Center in Warsaw, we have, and colleagues from Hebrew University in Israel, I shall say, we have also started an oral history project on this war and on the atrocities committed in this war. We will try to document them and also make them available for future historians, but also for future investigations into this violence. And whoever is interested in this project, please approach me, and maybe we can find means to cooperate, especially what Mrs. Busol has already talked about, seems to go into a similar direction. Be important to, I think, in the future coordinate these different projects that are already running about the ongoing war. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Jan, for this overview about the prehistory of the current war in the recent 30, 40 years. Of Soviet and Russian history. Yes, we can now start the discussion. Everyone is invited to write his or her questions into the chat, but I think we can start with some maybe additional questions or discussions among the panelists. Also, the panelists are invited to ask questions or comment on that what other speakers said. But maybe I will start with one or two questions that maybe I will start with these referring to some of the important remarks that Professor Graziosi made. There are 2 points I think that maybe, or one concrete point and one more general point that I think may be worth to go a little bit deeper into it. One is a question that also Jan Behrends addressed and very much stressed, but it did not appear in your talk. And I'm wondering if there is a disagreement, or if you think it's a little bit more complicated. That is the question of the tradition of the KGB, or the Soviet from the NKVD or the Cheka in the 1920s to the current time. Jan Behrends emphasized that for this the Russian situation, the Russian politics, and also the Putin regime for this up to the current war. But you said it's a complicated issue to see the relation between the 1930s, for example, until the current Russian politics, and did not mention the KGB and their tradition there. So that's one of the question. And I think the other question is that, or the other point, I think that is the larger point, and is one that we certainly will also continue for the coming years or maybe decades. That is what you call the normalization of Soviet history. Maybe you can a little bit more explain that, or what you mean with that, and what at which point went wrong in your view. That means the normalization of Soviet history in the international debate, in international, also among historians, etc.
Yes, thank you. Let me first say that I am in total agreement with Dr. Behrends. That is, the continuity traces is very much there. Of course, there are shades, because Liebet was not Rutskoy, that is, it's a different individual and I would certainly mention Abkhazia too, and what happened, and the Georgia affair is not so clear after all, because it's a different situation. But certainly, as a very good point, there is a continuity in the war experience that goes from Afghanistan through, I would say, the Chechen war, basically, number one, and especially number two, because after all was General Libby that stopped number one, as you remember, intervened. So there were also people that rethought their experience. But certainly Chechen war number two is crucial. And then of course is Syria. So I think that the chain there is much more evident in the behavior of the army, in the strategies that were adopted, and so on and so forth. The KGB is a different affair, because clearly the NKVD of the 30s up to Stalin's death was the institution that was really changed, even by Beria himself at the beginning, and then by Khrushchev, and then by Balyankov, of course. So the KGB was a different animal. That this continuity is different. Not that it was a nice organization, of course, it was a horrible organization. It did horrible things. it blackmailed people, it put people in psychiatric hospital, it marginalized people, it ruined so many lives, but did not resort to mass liquidation of people after 53. This cannot be said. The culture of the KGB under Andropov, who was, as you know, the proto-reformer, Gorbachev was, after all, one of his protege, makes this the story complicated. What I would stress is that we have as historian, I'm a historian, of course, I totally agree also with Svitlana Bilus, that work is precious, but as a historian, I think our duty is to clarify that the first part of Soviet history, not that this is terrible, of course it's terrible, but it is a genocidal history. And this evidence, which is evident by now, has not been yet fully, how to say, acknowledged. And then I would also stress, because that's a clearer continuity, the idea of that you can mass liquidate opponents, specifically targets opponents. Because for this, I think there is, let's say, a more clear case to be made than, for example, the use of famine in Ukraine or in the Kazakhstan. The Volga German Republic too is a very interesting story from this point of view. Here you could build an argument, the idea of this, you know, if you have I don't know if you have the history of the Volga German Republic in mind, but it was hit first by the cultural purge and religious purge, then by famine, then by the purges, then it was disbanded, then all the people were deported, involved in forced labor, and then totally annihilated, basically, culturally speaking, until the mass immigration to Germany after 88, I think, basically. So there too, this idea that you can dismantle a people. This is a tradition that is in Soviet, that passes from Soviet culture, from Stalinist culture to Putin. Putin is clearly thinking in this way, that you destroy certain groups, you change the culture of another group, and then you have, how to say, annihilated the people in a way. From this point of view, I do think that Putin has a genocidal way of thinking. I don't know if he will commit an actual genocide if already committed one, but clearly has a genocidal frame of mind. As to, I said already something about our job as a historian to clarify the first period, but certainly one cannot, I insist on this, because we cannot buy into this line that everything was always the same, because this is basically Putin argument. It was not, Gorbachev was not Putin. Even Andropov was not Putin in a way. And the Tsarist Russia was not Stalin's Russia, was much better. I'm not a pro-Tsarist person, of course. I thought the Tsarist empire was terrible, but was nothing to be compared with Stalinist, the Stalinist regime. So this idea of this eternal Russia, you remember the paintings by Ilya Glazunov that Putin liked so much. No, they are hanged, I think, besides the Kremlin, this eternal Russia going always with all these victorious men and generals and statesmen, all of them males, of course, that clearly use violence. You remember also the mosaic at the church now with all these generals, World War II. I totally agree with my friend Hrynevych that this idea of presenting World War I, only one side of it. The victorious male Russian that did horrible things all throughout Europe, also in Yugoslavia, by the way, in the north, where the past was terrible. And so we have to clarify this history. On the other hand, it's true that it's difficult to deny that after 53, also in Ukraine, there was a different history in the late 50s, early 60s, although it was built on lies in many ways about the past. But people had a normal life in a way, in quotation mark. This, I think, explain, I will not take too much time again, but why even Zelensky, you know, we got the phone call between Zelensky and Macron today, yesterday, the transcript, it's online. And even Zelensky said what Plakhisir, he, my friend, told me, and that so many, we didn't believe this was going to happen. We believed that maybe Biden was exaggerating. Because there was this normality of the Soviet past in the 60s and 70s, said it's impossible to have this. So I think this ambiguity of the history is there. And our job, I will finish with this, as historians, to prove that besides this normalization, behind this normalization, there is something else. And that this something else helped produce over the years what Professor Behrends said, and was reignited in the late 70s and the 80s, and especially in the 90s. I'm totally convinced that the 90s, up to the Chechen War, Chechen II, let's say, the Chechen War #2 is the crucial element of continuity there. Thank you so much.
Yes, Vladyslav wanted to comment on this. Yeah.
Я хочу втрутитися в цю дискусію відносно того, що НКВД не масових злочинів, а мовляв, якщо так ми виберемо, що армія виглядає немов гірше за НКВД. Справа в тому, що під час Другої світової війни, ну я думаю, і до того, власне кажучи, основним, ну, скажімо, тим апаратом, інститутом, який проєктував і здійснював злочини, було якраз НКВД. Ну, далі в військах був СМЕРШ, це також скажімо так, органи певні. І якщо ми візьмемо ту ж польську війну, то коли почався наступ радянський в Польщу в 1939 році, то в передніх колонах йшли групи НКВД, щось таке схоже на есесівські оці, які в 1941 році, які мали знищувати і арештовувати хто чинить опір, чи там керівництво, захоплювати документи і багато-багато чого іншого. Ну, а власне кажучи, НКВД і взагалі ці органи, вони організовували один з найбільших злочинів часів Другої світової війни. Це масові депортації. Армія тільки виступала, ну, тією живою силою, яка допомагала, а організація всіх цих переселень людей масові, народів, внаслідок яких гинули десятки тисяч людей. Ну, візьмемо, скажімо, той самий кримських татар. Організація депортації кримських татар і інших народів Криму, внаслідок якої тільки при перевезенні загинуло там 50%. Це справа рук КГБ, НКВД тодішнього. Як можу називати ще багато інших злочинів НКВД. Так що тут, мені здається, абсолютно невірно якось робити з НКВД такий інститут, який не мов би він так не причетний до оцих масових воєнних злочинів проти людяності, в тому числі. І це, мені здається, ну, певною мірою очевидно. Другий момент – те, що коли ми говоримо про таку нормальну історію, я людина, яка, власне кажучи, якраз жила при цій нормальній історії, це 70-ті, 80-ті, 90-ті роки. Ну, якщо б, власне кажучи, ну, певною мірою населення України сприймало створений радянський за чисту монету, безумовно, під час бачуся сьогодні і гласності не було б такої масової підтримки. І потім в 91-му році 90% населення не проголосували за вихід з Радянського Союзу. Тому, мені здається, ми маємо трошки обережніше ставитися до розуміння нормалізації цієї радянської, де не було такої нормалізації. Ми зараз працюємо, до речі, над дуже важливою такою, скажімо, темою, як новітні програми для шкіл, для історичні. Зараз підготовлена нова програма радикальна, яка змінює, і ми переглядаємо історію, яка за останні 30 років не змінювалася радикально з початку 90-х років, тільки точково, скажімо так. І от, власне кажучи, там ми розглядаємо всі ці ненормальні процеси, про які йдеться, і розглядаємо Радянський Союз як тоталітарну імперію і Україну як залежну територію. І я хочу сказати, що, безумовно, це, мені здається, дуже нам дає розуміння для того, до речі, в цій новій шкільній програмі для учнів є окремий розділ про російсько-українську війну, про рашизм, про руський мір і багато про що інше, для того, щоб наші сучасні діти розуміли, що відбувається, і в школах це буде вивчатися. Дякую.
Yes, that was a...
May I just, because maybe there was an misunderstanding. I never maintained that the NKVD did not make mass crime. I just said that after 53, it's difficult to establish a continuity because we know that it was the most purged Stalinist institution, and in the 60s and 70s did not perpetrated that kind of mass extermination. But of course, up to 1953, the NKVD was the most important organization for mass crimes. This goes without saying. I'm very sorry if I didn't think I said so, but if I gave that impression, it was simply a wrong impression, of course.
Okay.
Yes, Katarina, there's an...
Thank you very much. I have 3 reflections on the discussed issues. The first one is actually a response to a question from Dr. Mark Menenko regarding Russia's approach to international law and whether it's alternative to the one of the hypothetical West and whether we might expect the more of such deviations. And it's interesting to point out that Russia actually does not renounce international law. In fact, it does use actively and increasingly more the categories of international law of the UN Charter to justify its actions. And just to make a couple of examples, for instance, President Putin, when announcing his special military operation against Ukraine, specifically referred to the provisions of the UN Charter related to self-defense, essentially arguing that they act in prevention of the possible larger threat to the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, which they have recognized, and also to Russia. Or, for instance, Russia actively uses the category of international laws such as mercenaries. And as we know, there are reports of the torture of the prisoners of war who are prisoners of war under international law, whom Russia does misqualify as mercenaries. So it is a very, interesting and disturbing approach because Russia does not renounce international law. What it does, of course, is twisting and turning it pursuant to its own interpretation. And actually, I think also one of the saddest examples is also Russia's resort to the legacy of the Nuremberg trials, and like parallel to Ukraine's justice efforts and the trials Ukraine is trying to lobby with respect to war crimes and the crime of aggression, Russia essentially proposes an idea of what they call, and they're also the Commission of the Historians researching the World War II, called the Nuremberg 2.0, the second Nuremberg. The second point I wanted to make was regarding the issue of documentation, which Mr. Jan Behrends has risen. I think it's crucially important, obviously, to document the crimes, and the Russia-Ukraine armed conflict is arguably the most documented armed conflict we are witnessing live. And this poses both opportunities, including for the justice issues, but it also poses great threats. And I am just back from Bucha and Irpin, where I worked with survivors, and many of them are increasingly reluctant to go to courts, be that the Ukrainian courts or the International Criminal Court in The Hague or any other court. Why? Because there's so much good willingness from the lawyers, from human rights activists, from academics, from journalists to document their stories that victims get re-traumatized. And my conclusion, or rather the call here, would be, of course, not to abandon the documentation efforts, but really to harmonize them and to conduct this documentation in the as much survivor-sensitive, non-re-traumatizing manner as possible, because that also affects the story which people tell. And finally, the third point, where I think the exceptional professionals, the historians like you, could really make difference in terms of the justice domain, is Russia's violations against cultural heritage and Russia's, well, tangible manipulation with history. I worked a lot on Russia's violations against Ukraine's cultural heritage in Crimea, and it's scarily fascinating how Russia would change the names of, for instance, the burial sites of the Crimean Tatars, which predate Russia's presence in Crimea, or how for the construction of the so-called Kerch Bridge or the Crimean Bridge, Russia would destroy specifically Crimean Tatar and Muslim burial sites. And this is, you know, it could be just a legal discussion, but without a very informed historical argument, essentially why Russia is doing that, how that continues the imperial legacy of Russia's empire and Soviet Russia to the nowadays Russia, I think the legal argument would never be complete. So at least, or especially as regards the domain of cultural heritage, the input and the more analysis from the historians would be really helpful for the lawyers who do the trials. Thank you.
I think Jan Behrends has raised the hand and probably wanted.
Maybe just briefly, because some of the things were mentioned. I'm not going to get into everything. I think when it comes to international law, you know, we should distinguish maybe between the instrumentalization of a certain terminology by Russia, which also goes back, by the way, to the beginning of the Putin era and before. I remember being in the archives in Moscow and coming home in the early 2000s, I think during Putin's first term, and watching Russian TV. And there was every night there was in the news something about the genocide on Russians in Latvia. Well, of course, there was no genocide against Russians in Latvia in 2003 or 4, whenever this was, but the term was continually used in order to portray the state of Latvia as a not legitimate state. And, you know, maybe there was discrimination of Russians, I don't know, probably, but there was certainly no genocide, but the word was used over and over again. And I think we can see this normalization that they instrumentalize this Western terminology for their own use very early on. Another concept that they like to use is responsibility to protect, right? I mean, they just go into Ukraine because of their responsibility to protect Russian speakers. So they use these international law terms purely instrumental to justify their criminal policies. I wouldn't take that too seriously. I think we can see the neglect of the actual international law when we look, for example, at the education of or rather lack of education in international law of Russian soldiers and even officers. I know from my Ukrainian friends who are fighting that a lot of the Russian soldiers that were taken prisoner did not even have the information how to properly surrender to another combatant party, and were sometimes shot because they didn't, you know, raise their hands and threw away their weapons and something, but they wanted to surrender because they don't even get this basic training in law of warfare, international law. Nobody cares to train them in this. And I think, you know, there we can see that in the actual institution of the Russian army, there's a complete neglect of international law. because otherwise they would do that also for their own purpose. I mean, in every NATO army and in the Ukrainian army, of course, this is done, and in the Russian army, this is not done. And I think this is very important because it sees how the Russian state actually uses international law. And just one final comment, I very much agree with the problem of re-traumatization that was raised by Professor Buzo. Actually, what we are doing in our project is we have workshops for the people who do the interviews, and we try to make this as sensitive as possible, realizing that, you know, it might still be in some cases problematic, and then, you know, there's always the option, of course, to also stop an interview or have a break or something like that. But I realize that, you know, when we talk about this research into mass violence, we must always reflect what it does with the people we interview, but we should also reflect what it does with us. I mean, I remember dreaming of Stalin after reading Stalinist sources for like half a year for my dissertation, and it also does something with me, right? I mean, it's not that I'm immune against this, although I'm not actually there, I'm just the historian.
Yes, it's my, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for this comment. We have now already some questions in the chat, and I think we should address these questions. Katarina Bosal started already with one question, I think. There is two questions by Roman Serbin. One probably is also a question. The second one is also a question of international law, and therefore probably I would suggest that Katarina Buza reacts to it. The crimes against humanity and war crimes are part and parcel of the crime of genocide. Is that a correct assessment of the legal situation, or how are these different crimes related?
Thank you. Well, there still are three different categories, but I think the commentator is correct in saying that oftentimes, as practice of the Nuremberg trial or the Yugoslav tribunal or the International Criminal Court show that a certain conduct can constitute both a crime against humanity and a war crime, and sometimes a crime of genocide. So there can be parallel characterization, but actually these are three separate categories. The war crime is the violation of the law and customs of warfare, and it is always perpetrated either in an international armed conflict or in a civil war. Whereas, for instance, the crime against humanity does not require a context of hostilities, the context of an armed conflict. And this is, as I mentioned previously, is a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population pursuant to a state or organizational policy. Whereas the crime of genocide, legal definition is that it's the intention to destroy in whole and in part one of the four groups. And as we know, the person who coined the term genocide, Raphael Lemkin, envisaged that should be not only the physical destruction, but also the destruction through the elimination of culture, elimination of history, denial to speak a people's own language. But unfortunately, international law as of now is very limited, and it has a very restricted interpretation of the crime of genocide.
Yes, there's another question by Roman Serbin. Probably the most qualified panelist to answer that question is probably Professor Graziosi, but I don't know if we need to go into such detail here. But the question is, genocide is defined by the UN Convention as a crime against groups. My question: what were the specific victim groups of Stalin's genocide, and what was the specific purpose of genocide in each case? Answer, please.
Yes, if I may, because also there is a question of Frank Sissin that I think is strictly related to this. I could try very briefly, because of course these are huge topics to address them, because it's not so simple. Of course, genocide is violence committed against specific groups, defined in very largely terms. Only social groups and political groups are left out in the legal definition, but I'm no lawyer, so I will not enter into this. Clearly, Stalin, but in a way, as I said also during the Civil War with the Cossackization, there was a logic of hitting specific group of population. This specific group of population in Soviet history, and this was done through the NKVD, the Cheka first and then NKVD later on, were generally at the beginning social groups. You know, the Cossacks were both a social and a proto-ethnic group. I don't know how to define it. But certainly the Kulak were defined as a social group. And then it shifted slowly, not even so slowly, toward ethnic categories. This has been well described by historians, has been established, and also by religious and political groups. And of course, some are covered and some are not. I already mentioned that the Russian Orthodox Church had the highest number of victims related to the specific group. I would say more than 80%, if I remember correctly. The problem, the real question comes up with both the Holodomor and the Kazakhs extermination. I think here, and also to address Frank's question, ceasing question, which is a very interesting question. I think there is a long tradition in Europe, in European history, certainly from the late 18th century, but we can go back, I think, even. The idea that there were what already in the 19th century were openly called ethnographic material, meaning a sort of population that could be forced into changing their nationality. These were also, the Ukrainian were a typical ethnographic material. The Macedonian people, you know, both the Greek, not both, the Greek, the Bulgarian, and the Serbs believed that the Macedonian were ethnographic material. And that in order to transform an ethnographic material, you had to eliminate their elite, to impose your language, and to subdue the population. This model, by the way, you can find this throughout the 19th century. I will be very brief, but this is very interesting. Even if you read the Friedrich Engels in 1849, he said something like this, you know, Marx's friend, that in order to eliminate the counter-revolutionary nations, not classes, like the Czech or the Croatian, you had to extinguish their elite and to force them to change their language. And so these people that at this point would become ethnographic material could become proper German or proper, I don't know what. I think Stalin was very much into this logic. And the Holodomor was taught, we speak of the Holodomor, but I think it would be more correct to speak of a two-pronged assault that started before, as even Lemkin clearly saw and said and wrote. That is the elimination of the Ukrainian elite, intellectual church, and so forth, and the subjugation of the Ukrainian peasants. So from this point of view, Frank Sissin is right, there was an unmaking of the nation. From this point of view, though, Stalin is different from Putin because Stalin admitted the existence of Ukrainian. He wanted to reform, to have Ukrainian of his own liking, subdued, but he never thought of abolishing the Ukrainian. I think Putin, and with this I finish, is an extreme case because from this point of view is closer to part of the white nationalist movement. He believes that Ukrainians simply are a minor variety of the Russians. If they behave well, they can be recognized as a minor variety, but even this is not so clear. But this war has been, the documents that were produced clearly show the idea that you have to exterminate. Denazification is this, it's the elimination of the Ukrainian elite. At the beginning, they thought it was small, the criminal elite that was leading the Ukrainians to forget that they were Russian, a branch of the Russian family. And then the forcing of Russian culture upon the rest. And I think this is what is being done, and to go to another question, with the Ukrainians that have been deported to Russia, to the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian children. And I very much fear what is already happening in the occupied territories. Because clearly there is an application of this model. Liquidation of the elite, re-education with fear and force, and imposing a culture on this ethnographic material in the mind of Putin. Of course, these are human beings, are not ethnographic material at all. But the model is there. And it is a model of unmaking a people, or making a people in another, casting it in a new frame. And Putin is very much into it, unfortunately, and we are facing with this terrible ideas, which have clearly, as I said, a genocidal bent. I don't know if this genocidal intention has been already clearly and openly on a mass scale, implemented. This I cannot know, because we don't know the situation in the occupied territories so well yet. But there is a possibility, clearly.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much for this additional comment. What is does not shed such a positive light or a hopeful light on the situation, because in a way it's maybe I think it's what your argument is, that there are more, I think, if I understood it correctly, that are more radical traits now in this policy, that at least what is as intention and political program articulated therein than what we have in the Soviet Union, basically, in a way, because there is a more exterminatory visions with regard to the Ukrainian identity as there were in the Soviet Union. Yes, I'm looking if there are. Here we have one additional question that is maybe I could rephrase it somehow. I think it appeared also the question of a second Nuremberg that appears, has already a long tradition of discussion. It appeared probably also in one of the introductory statements, and is appears here now also in one of the questions. That is the question that also Katharina Busser addressed in her introductory statement of the legal responsibility and legal institutions that can address these crimes that are currently committed or have been committed in the recent months. Maybe you would like to comment on this question of
if I may add just on the crime of aggression.
Yeah,
thank you very much, because the institutions that I have mentioned, the International Criminal Court, Ukraine's obviously domestic criminal justice system, and the criminal justice systems of other states, like Germany or Switzerland, that can conduct the proceedings on the basis of the principle of universal jurisdiction, like they do, for instance, with respect to the crimes committed in Syria, because these atrocities are so atrocious that even a third country allegedly not affected by them can act upon them to ensure that no impunity is there for international crimes. However, all these mechanisms apply to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. They cannot act due to certain legalese limitations with respect to the crime of aggression. For instance, the International Criminal Court would be able to prosecute the crime of aggression only if both Russia and Ukraine A, ratified the Rome Statute of the court, and B, agreed to this particular aggression proceedings, which is not the case, of course. And that is why perhaps the question about the second Nuremberg concerns the discussions about a possible specialized ad hoc tribunal to prosecute Russia's political and military leadership for the crime of aggression, exactly because no other existing international court can prosecute this crime. And I don't probably want to bore you with too many technical details, but just to mention a few arguments in favor and against such a tribunal. Obviously, as we know from the experience of the Yugoslav tribunal, it is something very costly. It is very case specific, and in a way it's selective, because an argument is being made: if we prosecute Russia's aggression, why the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan invasions have not been prosecuted. The same issue applies with respect to, the selectivity and essentially how internationally recognized such a mechanism, an ad hoc mechanism, might be. And Ukraine still favors and lobbies actively the creation of such a specialized tribunal. The thing is that it proposes for the tribunal to be not of the Nuremberg style, meaning not that just 3 or 5 countries found it, but essentially that an international organization, for instance, a Council of Europe or the General Assembly of the UN, which, as we know, have voted very strongly through the resolution condemning Russian aggression, that these international institutions or the EU, for instance, might support the creation of the tribunal on their basis. Of course, this is one thing to vote for the resolution condemning aggression. There's another thing to establish a tribunal that will, if not physically capture, but at least issue arrest warrants with respect to particular people. That is why the creation of the tribunal is so protracted, is so complicated, and there is still no definitive response whether the Ukraine might be successful in this initiative to establish the tribunal. But currently, the position of the Ukrainian government is that they want this special mechanism to try the Putin regime, to send this no impunity signal to the rest of the world and to the future generations. And they also recognize that they understand that it's very unlikely that Mr. Putin or Mr. Lavrov will end up in the dock of the tribunal anytime soon. But what's important is the narrative, the historical record of Russia's intentions and conduct that would end up at least in an arrest warrant or in a judgment, for instance, if the proceedings are held in absentia. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this strong argument for prosecution, or for conducting or problems, addressing also the problems of conducting an international legal prosecution or trial of the current crimes. But this discussion about Nuremberg or Nuremberg II that also refers not only to the current situation, but it has already a long, I may add that, a long history as regarding to the question if there there should have been also in a similar international trial as was about the Nazi regime and its crimes after World War II, about Soviet mass crimes, sometimes in history, maybe in the 1990s after the end of the Soviet Union, and that this did not happen, contributed also to this, or to a certain degree at least, to the problems we currently have, and that is also related to this, I think related to this point of the normalization of Soviet history that occurred in the second half of the 20th century, and certainly to a certain degree at least continued also in the 21st century. So the question the question related to this is also how do we assess the the Soviet Union in the context of 20th century's history, European history. Yes. Are there any other questions or comments, or someone who wants to add something to that what we discussed and said already? So if not, I would like to thank all our panelists for their interesting, important, and enlightening contributions to this question that is unfortunately closely related to this ongoing war and probably ongoing crimes on the occupied territories, and that will clearly not be the end of the discussion of these issues, and they will certainly develop those in the legal sense of prosecutions and investigations, but also clearly the historical discussions about the assessment of how do we need to change our view of Soviet history in the 20th century, but also of the role of the Soviet Union and views of the Soviet Union in the history of the 20th century is certainly a discussion that we will continue. Not only we, but certainly many other people, historians, and also lawyers. Yes.
Thank you so much to everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. And